In 1983, a team of deeply pious scientists conducted a radical experiment in an undisclosed facility. The scientists had theorized that a human without any access to any senses or ways to perceive stimuli would be able to perceive the presence of God. They believed that the five senses clouded our awareness of eternity, and without them, a human could actually establish contact with God by thought. An elderly man who claimed to have nothing left to live for was the only test subject to volunteer. To purge him of all of his senses, the scientists performed a complex operation in which every sensory nerve connection to the brain was surgically severed. And although the test subject retained full muscular function, he could not see, hear, taste, smell, or feel. With no possible way to communicate with or even sense the outside world, he was essentially left alone with his thoughts. The scientists continued to monitor him as he spoke aloud about his state of mind in jumbled, slurred sentences that he couldn't even hear. After about 4 days had passed, the man claimed to be hearing hushed, unintelligible voices in his head. Assuming that it was an onset of psychosis, the scientists paid little attention to the man's concerns. 2 days passed, and the man had begun to cry, saying he could hear his dead wife speaking to him. And even more, he could communicate back. The scientists were intrigued, but were not convinced until the subject began naming dead relatives of the scientists. He repeated personal information to the scientists that only their dead spouses and parents would have known. At this point, understandably, a sizable portion of scientists left the study. After a week of conversing with the deceased through his thoughts, the subject became distressed, saying the voices were overwhelming. In every waking moment, his consciousness was bombarded by hundreds of voices that refused to leave him alone. He frequently threw himself against the wall, trying desperately to elicit a pain response. He begged the scientists for sedatives so he could escape the voices by sleeping. This tactic worked for 3 days, until he started having severe night terrors. The subject repeatedly said that he could see and hear the deceased in his dreams. Only a day later, the subject began to scream and claw at his non-functioning eyes, hoping to sense something, anything in the physical world. The hysterical subject now said the voices of the dead were deafening and hostile, speaking of hell and of the end of the world. At one point, he had begun to yell, "No heaven, no forgiveness," for 5 hours straight. He continuously and desperately begged to be killed. But the scientists were convinced that he was so close to establishing contact with God. After another day had passed, the subject could no longer form coherent sentences. Seemingly mad, he began to bite off chunks of his flesh from his arm. The scientists quickly rushed into the testing chamber and restrained him to a table so he could not continue to try and kill himself. After a few hours of being tied down, the subject stopped his struggling and screaming. He stared blankly at the ceiling as teardrops silently streaked across his face. For 2 weeks, the subject had to be manually hydrated due to his constant crying. Finally, he turned his head, and despite his blindness, made focused eye contact with a scientist for the first time in the entire study. He whispered, "I have spoken with God, and He has abandoned us." And with that, his vital signs stopped. There was no apparent cause of death.